the reasons I was so excited to present about listening for long-term learning is it represents an evolution in my market research career, and perhaps an evolution that people listening today may also be having in their own career. When I joined the market research industry, oh so long ago, I was a quant girl. I was a math geek. I was all about the statistics. So of course I joined an organization, Advanis, that literally wrote the book on discrete choice, max diff, and was very excited to live and breathe and work for a number of years in that quantitative analytical space. And what I've seen over the last few years in my research career is that, as Annie said, as big data starts to answer some of those what questions, research is also evolving. And we're seeing different types of projects becoming more and more common today. We're seeing a desire to have a consumer perspective on long-term trends. As mentioned in my bio, I love putting the consumer at the strategic table. So being able to think about not just what a consumer wants today, but what they're going to want in the long term is critically important. As well, what is disruptive in my industry? The number of times that people have said, what's going to be the next BlackBerry, iPhone, Uber that's going to completely upend my world? We ask that ourselves in market research all the time, and our clients are asking that all the time in their industries. And so being able to develop research programs and research projects that help to answer that is becoming more and more critical. And of course, every company wants to know, how can I improve within my market space, within my category? And so what I'm doing today is I have just 3 examples of projects where our clients took a bit of a courageous step with us to redefine the research, to do research in a different way that I think future-proofed their research, that gave them some longer-term learnings and gave them a different perspective on their consumers. So the first example I want to share, actually, first of all, the reason we always do this, just a little lovely quote, is I would say for the first half of my market research career, clients would come to me and say, I need you to build me a bridge. And I would say, okay, this is how we build a bridge. But really what they were saying is, we need to get to the other side of the river. And there are clearly many ways to do so. So our goal is to, again, redefine that research problem in a way that goes back to business decisions, to government decisions, because those are that is at the end of the day what needs to be solved is what is this business, what is this government agency going to do in the near and in the long term. So the first example I want to share with you is a Canadian health insurance example, and I want to emphasize Canadian because obviously if there's folks from the United States listening, the way that you interact with health insurance is a little bit different. In Canada, our primary care is government sponsored, but everyone does self-pay for a number of items, things like dental, things like some prescription drugs, chiropractic, massage, things like that. And so our client is a health insurance agency here in Canada, and they really they came to us with a research problem related to 2 major life stages where people are making health insurance decisions. The first life stage is the young millennials, so folks who are coming off of perhaps their parent plan or their student plan and are having to make their own health insurance decisions. The next major touch point is new retirees. So as you move off of perhaps an employer-sponsored plan and move into retirement, both your health needs are going to change and also your health insurance products will change. So our client came to us with a research question that said, hey, we want to test some new benefits and services for some insurance products that are catered to these 2 unique demographics. Can you help us with that? Of course we can. But as we started speaking to the clients involved in this, what we heard was they had some ideas, but they didn't have a really great grounded understanding on how these 2 demographics even thought of health insurance or even how they thought of health. So we actually expanded the research question. We wanted to know, let's find out everything we can about this life stage. Where does health fit into it, and where does health insurance therefore fit into health planning? So we broadened the research question, and we went from quant to qual in this case. And so we asked these 3 questions. What concerns, fear, and excitements do you have about this life stage? We then ask, how do you define good health? And then how does health fit into that life stage planning that they actually have to do, particularly for retirees who probably have a much more formalized plan to move into that life stage? So again, we changed our methodology from in-person, from quantitative to a combination of in-person focus groups and online bulletin boards. The online bulletin boards were important because we wanted to get a robust view of millennials, not just those who were in the two major cities in the region that my client works in, and because there is such a huge rural population, we wanted to make sure we were incorporating that as well. So some of the techniques we utilized in the qualitative were journey mapping. Tell us about the decisions. Tell us about your thoughts. Tell us about your fears of this life stage. And we really didn't even talk about health for about the first half of the time we spent together with these groups. We wanted to hear, did health come out organically? Then we did ask them to define good health. And this was probably the most interesting phase of the research because the way they defined health and the way they viewed themselves as healthy people was quite different than our preconceived notions. And one really poignant example of that is we anticipated the need to provide products that would care for new retirees as their health started to decline. And what we heard from them is that they're very much in control of their health. It's their elderly parents, 20 years, 25 years older, that were having the health crises, where health was becoming the most important issue that they were dealing with. And so we had to really think about lengthening that life stage and almost breaking it into substages in perhaps a way that, inside this client, they hadn't really thought about it that way before. And then the last thing we did was we actually asked them, once we got them thinking about health and their health needs at this life stage, we asked them to build an ideal service that would support them in those needs. And from that, we were able to then infer some of the product ideas and some of the service ideas and some of the public support that our client could then put into the marketplace. So that's one example. A very different example, the future of financial advice. Our client was a wealth advice firm, selling retirement and other investment products nationwide. And they were facing quite a bit of pressure from a number of areas that you can see here. This research was prompted by the first one you see, new regulations. But they recognized and realized that as these new regulations were by definition going to change the way they were going to have to work with the marketplace, that there are other things happening in the market, both internal and external, that also are going to play a role and impact how they should be interacting with investors in the future. And so they decided that because their view was very internalized, that they really wanted to get an outside view of how their network could change in the future. And so what we did was a non-primary research, which is very unusual for market research firms to be doing these days, to do a project that is entirely non-primary. And so we started out with secondary research. We defined a few problems based on the pressures that you saw on the previous slide. We started out with secondary research. We built core themes. And once we saw the core themes that were starting to emerge, we then identified thought leaders that could help us address each of the 4 core themes that we identified. And so we spoke to 4 very unique people. 2 were somewhat related to the financial advice industry. We spoke with someone we defined as a new financial planner. So they were in a non-competing region, another part of the world, but they had moved their agency practice to an entirely new model that was very different from the predominant model in the country we're speaking of. We spoke with them. We also spoke with someone who works for an oversight agency, again within the financial services industry. But then we spoke with 2 people who were completely out of the industry. We spoke with a demographer who could talk us through, again, the life stages and how the changing life stages were going to impact on this industry. And we spoke with a futurist whose specialty was the impact of technology. We spoke about Uber disrupting the industry, and we thought that something similar is definitely going to start to happen in the wealth advice industry, and so we wanted to have an outside perspective on how that might happen. Now, each of these 4 people, we presented them with a series of questions that guided our 1-hour discussion with each of them, and at the end of the day, we provided thematic reporting to our client. This became part of their strategic planning process as they moved through to the new regulations that are coming into effect in 2016 and 2017. It became a as I like to say, putting the consumers and putting ideas at the table that were outside of their internal organization. So it was broadening their viewpoint, and this was a very different type of project for them. But they came along for the ride, and I think that's very awesome. The last example is a communications audit. So this is a more traditional project. This was a government agency who came to us because they knew that they had a communications issue, that they had several communications issues. And it was not surprising because this government agency is responsible for health inspections throughout a region. And so their organization consists of staff members in a very diverse workplaces, everything from being in the head office to being literally on the road 5 days a week, with varying technology to support communication. And as well, they have to communicate to the stakeholders, to the organizations that they're inspecting. And of course, as health inspection regulations are very large, very cumbersome, and very technical in detail. So they knew that they were having a communications breakdown, and they wanted to try to solve as many of those breakdowns as they could. Importantly, they knew that they also had limits. They weren't going to be able to solve everything. They needed to know what to prioritize. What would be the most impactful change? What are changes that were within their purview? They have to sell into the larger government because their communications are restricted in some ways by rules that impact all departments of the government. So we took a three-pronged approach, starting in the bottom. We did a survey of all staff. We attempted a census of all staff members and all inspected organizations, a few hundred organizations. And the survey was very encompassing. It looked at things like, how do they communicate? What technology do they even have at their facility to communicate? Because these are plants, oftentimes the computer may only be in the office, may not be on the shop floor, things like that. And what successes was this agency having in terms of communicating, and what challenges were they having? So one of the very interesting parts about this is the idea of planning touch points throughout the research and planning preliminary reports rather than trying to get to a full button-down, beautiful PowerPoint report. So immediately after this survey was completed of the staff of the inspected organizations, we went to a preliminary report and presented that to our key stakeholders in a workshop. It wasn't pretty, it was a few slides, but the analysis was behind it. And what we did was we identified the communication successes and gaps. With our client, we workshopped and we selected those that were both most concerning to the client and most actionable to follow up on. And from there, we moved into IDIs. We had pre-asked everyone who took the survey if they'd be willing to participate in an IDI, but by doing the IDIs afterwards rather than perhaps more traditionally beforehand, we were able to then target the IDIs to people who were willing to participate, but who also gave survey responses that were consistent with the areas of concern that we had. And so the targeted IDIs allowed us to really dig into some concrete improvement areas and really personify and put a why, a how, and a voice of the customer into the voice of the customer, the voice of the employee into the final report, which was then presented to all of the management of this government agency. And we've already seen improvements that they've made in everything from their newsletter to how their emails are sent out to they're working on improvements to their website and working on ways to simplify the language of some of their control documents that go out on a regular basis. So the last thing I want to provide is just a few life pro tips. If you're a Redditor, you recognize the LPT hashtag on how to do research in a way that really invokes long-term listening. The first thing I want to say is always think about broader questions. I think Fiona talked about moving from, a marketing manager managing an individual product to being responsible for a category. This is the same thing. Instead of thinking about how to launch that particular product or improve that website, broaden out and say what are we really trying to accomplish in the next few years within this organization. Use skilled moderation. As I said, I am a quant girl by trade. I am not going to attempt to do something that I am not qualified for. So bringing in skilled partners to help you along in the design and in the implementation of different phases of the research is very important. Involving your participants as co-creators. I think this is the theme for my research. All the research work I'm going to do in the next year is really, even on traditional research projects, how can I change those survey questions from things that perhaps people taking surveys find boring and annoying to things that they feel like they're an equal participant in, and how can that improve the kinds of responses that we receive back, and ultimately the insights that we can generate from that. And take advantage of online and mobile tools. We still have to, we are still being asked to do research quickly and agilely, and so taking advantage of some of these tools can help you do that. And finally, and most importantly, for those clients listening on the call, being able to do this in a way that is both broad and timely does require a time commitment on everyone's part. And it just requires your ability to be open and to be in the room and to be present, and we can accomplish a lot of very amazing things together.